In the ancient world, merchants often kept a bag of stones with different weights. By swapping a lighter stone for a heavier one during a transaction, they rigged the scales to guarantee an outcome that favored themselves. This practice extended into the Roman legal system here in Caesarea. As the administrative capital of the province, its courts functioned on political favors, bribery, and the personal interests of the governors. Acts chapter 24 presents a historical irony. The Apostle Paul is brought to the city as a prisoner, subject to the whims of a corrupt court. Yet, by the end of the hearing, it is the judge with absolute power over Paul's life who is left trembling. Paul faces an immediate, lethal threat. The Jewish authorities in Jerusalem have hired a legal specialist to frame him for sedition, a charge that carries the death penalty under Roman law. Paul's survival rests in the hands of Antonius Felix, the Roman governor. Felix holds unchecked authority in the province, while Paul has no political standing and no physical means of escape. Examining the legal clash in Acts 24 demonstrates how a believer maintains a clear conscience while functioning as a political pawn. Paul's defense reveals a strategy for speaking truth inside a system designed to suppress it. The prosecution acts with speed. Only 5 days after Paul is moved to Caesarea, the high priest Ananias arrives with a legal team to present their formal charges. To navigate the Roman court, they hire a rhetorist named Tertullus. This lawyer is a skilled orator, specifically trained to use the language of the Roman legal system to achieve a conviction. Tertullus begins with heavy flattery, praising Felix for his reforms and the peace he brought to the nation. Historically, Felix was known for his brutality, and the peace Tertullus mentions was actually the result of violent purges and state terror. Tertullus organizes his attack into 3 categories: a personal charge, a political charge, and a doctrinal charge. First, he frames Paul as a troublemaker stirring riots. Second, he calls him ringleader of the Nazarene sect, implying sedition. Third, he accuses Paul of desecrating the temple. This alleged crime occurred in the inner precincts of the temple in Jerusalem. Because Rome allowed Jewish authorities to execute those who violated the temple's holiness, this charge provides a legal basis for Paul's death. Tertullus is framing a religious disagreement as a direct offense against the Pax Romana. He is presenting Felix with a narrative that demands a quick execution to preserve the peace of the empire. The strategy is built entirely on rhetorical pressure. Without concrete evidence, Tertullus relies on the governor's desire to appease the local leadership to secure conviction. Paul's response ignores the flowery rhetoric of his accusers. He focuses instead on the strict logical and evidentiary constraints of the Roman legal process. Paul provides a mathematical defense. He points out that he arrived in Jerusalem no more than 12 days ago, making it logistically impossible to organize a global revolt. He then notes the lack of evidence, as the prosecution has produced 0 witnesses to any disturbance. Paul then points to a massive procedural flaw in the case. The Jews from the province of Asia, those who actually initiated his arrest, are not present in the courtroom. Under Roman law, these primary witnesses were required to bring their charges in person. Their absence suggests that the current proceedings are a violation of the very judicial process Felix is sworn to uphold. Finally, Paul addresses the temple charge. He explains that he was found there while performing ritual purification and bringing gifts to his people, actively honoring the law and the prophets. Paul's defense dismantles the capital case. By highlighting the absence of witnesses and the logistical impossibility of the charges, he leaves the prosecution with nothing more than an unprovable smear campaign. With the legal charges neutralized, Paul shifts from defending his actions to challenging the court's theological perspective. He centers his entire argument on a single point: the resurrection of the dead. This is a calculated move. Paul knows that the Jewish leadership is divided on this issue. The Pharisees believe in a resurrection, while the Sadducees, who brought the charges, deny it entirely. Paul explains that his hope in a future resurrection for the righteous and the unrighteous is the reason he strives to maintain a clear conscience. For Paul, the reality of a coming judgment dictates his present conduct. This changes the jurisdiction of the trial. Felix must now recognize that he is being asked to rule on an internal theological debate rather than a civil crime or a political insurrection. Because of this shift and the previous report from the commander Lysias, Felix realizes he cannot legally execute Paul. He adjourns the hearing, claiming he will decide the case when the commanding officer arrives. Paul's focus on the resurrection moves the conversation away from the threat of execution and forces the Roman court to acknowledge the core message of the Christian gospel. Days later, Felix summons Paul for a private discussion. He is joined by his wife Drusilla, a member of the Herodian family, who likely provided the governor with his prior knowledge of the way. As Paul speaks, Felix enters a state described as imphobos. The absolute ruler of the province is physically terrified, visibly shaken by his prisoner. Felix's fear comes from the specific topics Paul discusses: righteousness, self-control, and judgment. These concepts directly confront Felix's lifestyle of ruling through cruelty and stealing Drusilla from her previous husband, highlighting the governor's deep personal moral failures. Faced with the reality of his own lack of self-control, Felix refuses to make a decision. He sends Paul away, delaying the confrontation indefinitely. The delay is not just a refusal to repent, it is also a play for profit. Felix continues meeting with Paul over the next 2 years, not out of a search for truth, but in the hope of receiving a bribe. These silver coins were the common currency of provincial corruption. Taking bribes from prisoners was a violation of Roman law, yet it was a practice Felix engaged in frequently. Felix is once again using unjust weights. He is weighing Paul's freedom against the potential for personal financial gain, choosing his own agenda over the demands of justice. Despite his absolute earthly power, Felix is paralyzed. He is caught between the corruption of his own system and the inescapable reality of divine accountability. The immediate result of the trial is a 2-year imprisonment. Felix leaves an innocent man in chains, choosing to do the Jewish leaders a political favor rather than upholding the law. Eventually, Felix is recalled to Rome due to his excessive harshness and replaced by Porcius Festus. Paul remains in prison, his legal status still unresolved. From a human perspective, Paul is a victim of the shifting tides of the Roman Empire, subject to the indifferent decisions of men like Nero. It appears as though the Roman system has entirely failed. Paul's logical defense and his appeals to evidence seem to have left him exactly where he started, in a cell. However, this outcome aligns with the prophecy given in Acts 9. Paul was chosen specifically to carry the name of God before Gentiles and kings. Paul has become a political pawn in the will of God. Human corruption and the whims of governors are the very mechanisms through which Paul fulfills his divine mission to speak to the highest levels of Roman authority. Faithfulness in this context is found in the maintenance of a clear conscience through years of silence and detention. Paul's success is measured by his steady witness, not by a quick release from a corrupt system. His role is to speak of righteousness and resurrection, regardless of how the scales of earthly justice are being manipulated. Acts 24 shows that earthly injustice and corrupt governance are ultimately unable to thwart the progress of a sovereign God. The rigged scales of men cannot stop the work of his chosen instrument.